They said Sophia was reckless, too untested to carry the weight of combat on her narrow shoulders. She was young, barely 27, her frame slight compared to the hardened veterans around her. The whispers never stopped. To some, she was only a pretty face, someone who didn't belong in a place where grit and scars were the true currency. That autumn morning at Fort Alden was sharp and unforgiving. The sky was the color of cold steel, and the wind sliced through uniforms like a blade. Every breath seemed to echo against the walls of the compound. As Sophia walked across the yard, her boots pressing firmly into the gravel, she felt the weight of eyes following her. "Wrong place for her," someone muttered. "She'll trip over her own rifle," another laughed. The sting of those words should have burned, but Sophia's jaw remained set. Her cap sat low on her brow, her hands relaxed at her sides, and her eyes locked straight ahead. She didn't answer them. Silence was her weapon, sharper than any retort. The squad was lined up for a close-quarters combat drill. It was supposed to be routine, mock aggressors, simulated chaos, a test of reflexes and precision. But for Sophia, it was never just another exercise. She knew the unspoken truth. This was a test of her worth, whether anyone said it out loud or not. Sergeant John Vance, a tall man with shoulders like slabs of stone, stood at the front. His eyes flicked to Sophia with a glimmer of amusement, a half-smile that suggested he had already decided what she was capable of. "Cole," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Hand it over." Sophia froze for a fraction of a second, letting his words settle. She unclipped the holster at her side and placed her M9 pistol in his palm. The metallic snap of the buckle echoed louder than it should have. "You won't be needing this today," Vance added, his words deliberately loud. A ripple of laughter spread through the squad, sharp and cutting. "Now she's harmless," someone chuckled. Sophia didn't react. She only gave a small nod, as if she had agreed to the rules of a game none of them realized she had already mastered. Specialist Michael Grant, the youngest in the squad, watched quietly. Unlike the others, he saw something they missed. Sophia's shoulders didn't tense at the humiliation. They loosened. Her breathing slowed, steady as if she were preparing for a plunge into cold water. Later, Michael would describe it as the calm before a storm. The signal to begin thundered across the yard. Boots struck the gravel as role-players stormed the mock compound, shouting commands, rifles raised. Chaos erupted instantly. The squad scrambled, rifles jerking left and right, panic threading into their movements. Sophia moved with them, unarmed, the smirks of her squad mates pressing harder than the enemy's advance. They expected her to stumble, to prove them right. But she didn't stumble. She watched. Every angle, every sloppy swing of a rifle, every exposed weakness, they revealed themselves to her in the blur of confusion. Then the drill twisted. Two aggressors moved off script, breaking formation. They advanced too fast, too close, weapons raised in a way that felt less like training and more like danger. The squad hesitated, caught between panic and indecision. Sophia tilted her head slightly, her expression calm, almost serene. To some, it looked like surrender. But to Michael, it looked familiar, the same stillness he had seen in photographs of combat medics kneeling under fire, the quiet certainty of those who had already lived through worse. The sergeant's smirk lingered at the edge of her vision. She ignored it. This wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about proving something far more important, to herself. She didn't need a pistol at her hip to know who she was when the world grew sharp and dangerous. And in 30 seconds, she would show them all. The first shove came suddenly, hard enough to slam one of Sophia's squad mates against the concrete wall of the mock compound. His rifle clattered against the barrier, echoing like a warning bell. The role player pressed in with a training blade, too close, too quick. What was supposed to be a drill fractured into raw panic. Shouts erupted. Boots scraped furiously across gravel. The sharp smell of dust rose into the morning air as the squad scrambled, their weapons swinging without focus. Orders overlapped, dissolving into chaos. But Sophia did not flinch. She didn't dart left or right, didn't grab for permission with her eyes the way some did. She stepped forward instead, as if she had been waiting for this precise moment. Her movements were calm, deliberate, a slow rhythm inside a storm. The first aggressor lunged at her, emboldened by her empty hands. To him, she was the easiest target, the unarmed one, the weak link. That was the mistake. Sophia pivoted on the ball of her foot, swift as water slipping past stone. She caught his wrist, redirected the motion, and with one controlled twist, stripped the blade from his grip. In a blur, the weapon was pressed harmlessly against his chest, a mock kill. Before he realized he had been beaten, she had already moved on. Gasps rippled from the squad. The laughter that had filled the yard only moments before died in their throats. Contact left, a soldier shouted desperately, but Sophia was already moving. The second aggressor charged, rifle raised high to strike. Sophia closed the distance with uncanny precision. She snapped her elbow into the joint of his arm, forcing the weapon off target. With a smooth twist, she tore it from his hands, his own momentum carrying him off balance. In a heartbeat, he was pinned to the ground, his mock rifle skidding across the gravel. By now, the silence was deafening. Rifles that had been raised hung slack at the shoulders of her squadmates. They were stunned, frozen, forced to watch as she dismantled her opponents without hesitation. Another hostile appeared from the right. Sophia swept his legs out from under him in one motion, his body hitting the ground with a thud. She spun the training pistol from his belt and tossed it aside before he could react. A fourth came at her from behind. She caught his arm mid-swing, twisting until he dropped the blade. Her grip locked into a chokehold, precise and controlled, never cruel, just decisive. He tapped out before the pressure grew dangerous. Every movement flowed into the next, seamless as though she had rehearsed this dance her entire life. But Sophia hadn't learned this in any classroom. She had learned it in silence, in the unglamorous weight of years spent mastering disciplines most dismissed as extras. She had studied close-quarters combat until it became a second language, and now that language was spoken with perfect clarity. From the sideline, Sergeant John Vance barked orders, his voice breaking with disbelief. He had expected her to crumble, to confirm his doubts. Instead, he was watching his weak link dismantle every hostile on the field. His jaw tightened, his face flushing red as his authority slipped further with every passing second. One by one, the role players hit the ground, their mock weapons scattering uselessly. What was meant to humiliate Sophia had transformed into a proving ground. Time bent strangely in those moments. 30 seconds stretched into forever. Every soldier watching could count the heartbeats, could track every motion burned into memory. And yet, before they knew it, it was over. The last aggressor swung his rifle at her desperately. She deflected the blow, wrenched the weapon free, and slammed it against the wall, pinning him with a palm to his chest. The fight ended in silence. The yard froze. Dust swirled in the air, catching sunlight like fragments of fire. Sophia's chest rose and fell with steady breaths. Sweat darkened her temples, strands of hair sticking against her skin, but her eyes remained calm, unshaken. 6 role players lay disarmed around her. Her squadmates stood wide-eyed, their rifles still raised but never fired. For 30 seconds, Sophia had turned humiliation into dominance. Stripped of her weapon, stripped of credibility, she had shown that skill and composure outweighed steel every time. The role players sat up slowly, groaning, but their expressions held no mockery now. They looked at her with something entirely different, respect. Specialist Michael Grant, still clutching his rifle in disbelief, straightened his shoulders. Pride flickered in his young eyes. He had known from the beginning she was different. Now everyone else knew too. Sophia didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. She simply handed the training blade to the nearest instructor, stepped back into formation, and waited quietly for the next command. The silence that followed weighed heavier than any report ever could. It was the silence of realization, the silence of respect. And though no one dared admit aloud, everyone knew the truth. 30 seconds had rewritten everything. The gravel crunched faintly under boots, but no one moved with purpose. The mock compound felt suspended in time, a stage where the laughter had died and something far heavier had taken its place. Dust hung in the air, catching in the steel-gray light of morning, as if even the wind hesitated to disturb the silence. Sophia stood at the center of it all, unarmed yet unshaken. Her chest rose and fell in calm rhythm, each breath measured like a drumbeat no one else could hear. Around her, the role players stirred slowly, groaning as they sat up from where she had put them down. Some rubbed bruised wrists, some caught their breath, but none carried mockery in their eyes anymore. The squad, still frozen in their places, lowered their rifles awkwardly. The metal clink of straps loosening was the only sound. A moment ago, they had laughed at her. Now, none of them could meet her gaze. Sergeant John Vance's face flushed an angry red. He had been so certain that stripping Sophia of her pistol would expose her weakness. Instead, it had exposed his own failure to see her strength. His jaw clenched, his voice finally breaking the silence. "Reset the drill," he barked. But the command rang hollow, bouncing off the compound walls without authority. The role players exchanged glances, but didn't rise. The squad shifted uncomfortably, caught between obedience and disbelief. Even the air seemed unwilling to obey him. Sophia did not react. She didn't smirk, didn't challenge him, didn't bask in victory. She stood silently in formation, hands loose at her sides, the picture of composure. That silence was more powerful than any words she could have spoken. Vance marched toward her, boots striking the gravel with sharp cracks. His hand still rested on the pistol tucked into his belt, the same weapon he had taken from her minutes earlier. "You think this proves something?" he snapped, his voice low but shaking. Sophia's eyes met his without wavering. She said nothing, and that silence broke him more than any reply could have. Then came the sound that silenced even Vance, the slam of a car door echoing across the yard. Heads turned sharply. A black sedan, unnoticed until now, had rolled to a stop at the edge of the compound. Striding toward them was a figure who commanded silence, without asking for it. Colonel Robert Langford, the base commander. His uniform was immaculate, his ribbons catching the light, his expression carved from stone. Every soldier straightened instinctively. Even Vance stiffened, though his cheeks still burned with humiliation. Langford's eyes scanned the yard, the scattered role players, the subdued squad, the sergeant quivering with anger. Finally, his gaze landed on Sophia. He stopped. "Who disarmed her?" Langford asked, his voice quiet yet heavy enough to carry across the yard. The sergeant swallowed. I did, sir. It was part of." "Part of what?" Langford's tone cut like a blade. "Part of humiliating your own officer in front of her squad? Part of ignoring her service record because you think a weapon defines her?" The squad shifted under the weight of his words. None dared look at Sophia now, ashamed that they had played along in her humiliation. Langford stepped closer to her, his boots moving with deliberate weight. For the first time, the squad saw something in Sophia's presence that they had missed, the colonel's respect. "Lieutenant Sophia Cole," he said firmly, his voice dropping the titles of mockery others had used. "I reviewed your file last week. Advanced certification in Krav Maga, close quarters combat instructor, commendations for saving fellow soldiers during Operation Viper Nest when ammunition ran dry. Twice you've held a line with nothing but your hands and resolve. And yet," he gestured at the squad, "you are treated like decoration." His eyes narrowed, sharp as ice. "Tell me, what did you just demonstrate here?" The yard fell into absolute silence. Sophia's voice, when it came, was soft but unwavering. "That a weapon is a tool, sir," she said, "not an identity." The words lingered in the cold morning air. They sank into the hearts of every soldier present, into every smirk that had once doubted her. The colonel nodded slowly, his expression unreadable, but his respect unmistakable. He turned to the squad, his voice rising so every ear heard. "You all witnessed 30 seconds of what leadership really looks like. Calm under pressure, skill under scrutiny, courage without noise. If any of you believe respect can be carried into battle with only a rifle in hand, you are already dead. Respect is carried here." He tapped his chest. "And here." He tapped his temple. No one dared scoff now. No one dared laugh. Sergeant Vance's face burned crimson as he tried to salvage dignity. But even his own squad avoided his eyes. And then, one by one, the soldiers turned toward Sophia. Slowly, almost reluctantly at first, then with growing certainty. A chin dipped. A rifle lowered in acknowledgement. A hand raised in salute. It wasn't because they had been told to. It was because they knew it was owed. In perfect unison, boots slammed together, and the squad saluted their lieutenant properly for the first time. Sophia didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She returned the salute with quiet precision, then lowered her hand, stepping back into formation as if nothing had changed. But everything had. By evening, Fort Alden was no longer quiet. The barracks buzzed with whispers and retellings, each soldier eager to recount the scene they had witnessed that morning. Every version grew larger in the telling. 6 aggressors became 8. The 30 seconds stretched into a minute. But one truth never changed. Lieutenant Sophia Cole had turned humiliation into command without firing a single shot. In the mess hall, soldiers leaned over trays of food, trading fragments of a story as if it were already legend. Some swore they had seen her disarm 2 men at once. Others claimed the sergeant's face had gone white as chalk. The details blurred, but the essence remained the same. Respect had shifted that morning, and no rumor could contain it. Even the role players, bruised but unbroken, admitted quietly among themselves that they had never been dismantled so efficiently. They had trained against dozens of officers, but none had subdued them with such controlled precision. It was not brute strength that defeated them. It was something rarer, composure under chaos, the refusal to lose control even when stripped of every advantage. Sophia heard the whispers too, though she didn't seek them out. When she walked through the barracks, heads turned slightly, voices dipped, not in mockery this time, but in curiosity and something resembling admiration. She ignored it as she always did. She hadn't fought for their approval. She had simply done what she knew to be right. Colonel Robert Langford, however, refused to let the incident remain rumor. Days later, he gathered the entire base for an assembly. Soldiers filed into the vast steel-framed hall, the air heavy with anticipation. The colonel stood at the front, his presence filling the space before he spoke a word. "I will not repeat rumors," he began, his voice echoing against the beams above. "Rumors change with each telling, but truth remains the same, no matter how many mouths carry it." He paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. "This week, in a simple training drill, one officer was stripped of her weapon and mocked by her own squad. She was laughed at. She was underestimated. And in 30 seconds, she turned that mockery into silence." His gaze swept the room, catching every soldier's eye before landing on Sophia. She sat straight-backed in the second row, her expression calm, though her heartbeat thudded steadily in her chest. "Lieutenant Sophia Cole," Langford said, his voice steady, "did not need a pistol to command respect. She did not need to raise her voice, nor seek revenge. She demonstrated what leadership truly is: discipline, training, and courage carried within, not strapped to a hip." The hall was silent, not the silence of duty, but the silence of reverence. 30 seconds, Langford repeated, his voice like thunder rolling across the steel rafters. "That is how long it took her to prove that arrogance dies quickly, but discipline endures. 30 seconds to show that the one you dismiss today may be the one who saves you tomorrow." The words sank deep into every listener. Some shifted in their seats, guilty for having been part of the laughter. Others sat taller, inspired by the truth of it. When Langford finished, he gestured for Sophia to stand. Reluctantly, she rose, her boots clicking softly on the floor as she stepped forward. The colonel introduced her not as the officer they thought they knew, but as the warrior who had once saved a squad in the field when rifles jammed and enemies pressed close. He stripped away rumor, left only the truth. She was more than capable, more than decoration, more than what they had assumed. Sophia bowed her head slightly, then returned to her seat without a word. She did not bask in the attention. She never wanted to. But she knew something had shifted permanently. From that day forward, new recruits arriving at Fort Alden were taken to the training yard where the incident had occurred. Instructors pointed to the corner of the compound where Sophia had first stood empty-handed. They told the story, not as myth, but as doctrine. "Here," they would say, "is where Lieutenant Sophia Cole taught this base that strength is not always loud, that leadership is not the weapon in your hand, but the calm in your heart when the world unravels." Weeks later, A plaque was mounted on the compound wall. Simple words, etched into steel. 30 seconds. Lieutenant Sophia Cole. Respect is not armed. It is earned. Sophia never asked for it, never wanted her name on display. But she also never argued against it. She understood that it wasn't about her anymore. It was about the recruits who would one day stand in that yard, hearing the story, learning that courage meant far more than the steel of a pistol. At night, when the yard lay empty and the wind carried the faint rattle of loose chains against the fence, Sophia sometimes walked past the plaque alone. She would pause briefly, her eyes tracing the letters, not with pride, but with remembrance. She remembered the laughter that morning. She remembered the silence that followed, and she remembered the truth that silence carried louder than any gunshot. Even disarmed, she had never been powerless. Months passed, yet the echoes of that morning refused to fade. The story of Lieutenant Sophia Cole had become part of Fort Alden's rhythm, whispered in corridors, retold in classrooms, repeated on training fields. Recruits who had never seen her fight could recite the details as if they had been standing there, eyes wide, watching her dismantle 6 aggressors with nothing but her hands and discipline. It wasn't just a story anymore, it was a standard. Instructors invoked her name when teaching close-quarters drills. Remember Cole? They'd say when a cadet hesitated, when someone panicked under pressure. Weapons are tools, but courage is carried here. They tapped their chest, echoing the colonel's words. It became a mantra, not just for the new recruits, but for the veterans too. Sophia, however, never treated herself like a legend. She carried on with her duties quietly, leading her squad with calm precision. She drilled them harder than before, not because she sought revenge for their past mockery, but because she knew they needed to understand discipline the way she did, not as a rule, but as a lifeline. Her squad began to change. Michael Grant, once the youngest and least certain, grew sharper under her guidance. He no longer hesitated in simulations, no longer let panic steer his rifle. He often recalled that morning, remembering how she had breathed like a diver preparing to plunge into deep water. He carried that lesson into every drill, finding stillness in the storm. Even Sergeant John Vance, though pride kept him silent, trained differently after that day. He barked fewer insults, relied less on humiliation, and watched Sophia with grudging respect. His anger had been real, but deeper than that was the recognition that he had been wrong. And soldiers, even stubborn ones, cannot ignore truth forever. Outside the base, word traveled. Other units heard of the lieutenant who had proven strength without firing a round. Visitors came to the yard, pointing to the plaque, asking to hear the full account. Some dismissed it as embellishment, but those who had seen it swore on their honor that every detail was real. Sophia never corrected the stories, never added or subtracted. When asked, she only said, "It was 30 seconds." Nothing more. And yet, those 30 seconds grew heavier the more they spread, not as a burden, but as a reminder. She carried them with her during every night patrol, every briefing, every silent march across the compound. She knew that moment did not define her alone. It belonged to everyone who had doubted, everyone who had learned, everyone who now carried themselves taller because of it. One crisp evening, months later, Sophia walked the training yard alone. The sky above was the same sharp steel gray it had been that morning, the wind slicing across the open ground. The plaque glinted faintly in the fading light. She stopped before it, reading the words once again. 30 seconds. Respect is not armed. It is earned. She traced the air above the letters with her fingertips, not touching the cold metal, but feeling the weight of it all the same. Behind her, footsteps approached. Michael Grant appeared, his rifle slung across his shoulder, his expression thoughtful. "Ma'am," he said softly, "they're telling the story to the new recruits right now." Sophia glanced toward the compound where voices echoed faintly, instructors retelling the lesson yet again. She gave a small nod. "Do you ever get tired of hearing it?" Michael asked. Her lips curved faintly, though not quite into a smile. "It was never about me," she replied. "It's about what they learn from it." Michael stood beside her in silence, his gaze resting on the plaque. After a moment, he said, "That day changed the way I see everything, the way I see myself. I wanted you to know that." Sophia's eyes lingered on him, and for a heartbeat, the calm in her gaze softened. Then it wasn't wasted, she said quietly. The wind carried their silence across the yard, the same silence that had once replaced laughter, a silence that spoke of respect, of lessons carved deeper than steel. Sophia turned at last, her boots crunching on the gravel as she walked back toward the barracks. She carried herself the same way she always had, steady, composed, unflinching. But those who saw her now understood something they hadn't before. The strength she bore wasn't in her weapon. It was in her silence, her discipline, her refusal to break when stripped of everything else. 30 seconds had taught an entire base that leadership is not loud, not boastful, not defined by the weight of a pistol. Leadership is the quiet resolve to stand firm when everything falls apart. And for as long as Fort Alden stood, recruits would walk that yard, see that plaque, and remember the young lieutenant who had shown them that truth. 30 seconds. That was all it took.